Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name, salvation has been brought down, oh glory, praise the Lord.
Welcome to the Harvester Podcast. We are happy that you are listening to us today. And we begin our Season 4 a couple episodes ago. This is our third episode in Season 4. And I'm your host, Brian Kenyon. And for now, we're going to have some guest hosts as we go through this season. But we are going to be talking about the expediencies of marriage. The expediencies of marriage, a study of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, in the previous episodes, we did lay the groundwork for this study, namely by looking at some passages, major passages in the Bible that have to do with marriage and the effect that and how that applies to 1 Corinthians 7. We considered Genesis 2, verses 18 through 25, which is the foundation of marriage, on the sixth day of creation when God created Eve, well, Adam and Eve for that matter, but Eve is depicted there in chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, and we noted from that marriage is, as a God-ordained relationship, must be monogamous, must be a companionship relationship, must be an interdependent relationship, must be a commitment relationship, and it must be a permanent relationship in God's eyes. And so we notice that there are only two reasons that Paul gives that a person can remarry, and that both of those involve the breaking of the one flesh relationship. Obviously, in death, they can no more be one flesh, and so God allows remarriage then. But also, when fornication is involved, and we talked about that a little bit, and fornication does break that one flesh relationship, and in such cases, God does give a right to the innocent of fornication spouse in a scriptural divorce to remarry with God's approval. And so then we looked at Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12, to see what Jesus had to say about marriage, and that also was based upon Genesis 2:24. And we learn here that Jesus again says, except it be for fornication, that for one to remarry would be sinful. And so in that passage also, we did take a look at Deuteronomy 24, the writing of divorcement, and we saw in that passage that Deuteronomy 24 is not giving a reason for divorce, but it is simply describing a situation in which if this occurs, then that first husband cannot have her back again, and we discussed the implications of that. And so today we are ready to begin our actual study on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And let me just read the first verse. Chapter 7, verse 1 says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me." And this is significant here because that statement is repeated again about 4 or 5 more times throughout 1 Corinthians. And it is a formula, if you will, introducing topics that the Corinthians asked Paul in a previous letter. We do not have a copy of that letter. It did not come down to us by the providence of God, so we don't know the exact wording of their questions. However, from Paul's answers, we do get an idea of the things they asked him about. And so the very first thing he starts out with is marriage, concerning the things you wrote unto me. And so then he begins, and we'll just go ahead and we're going to cover verses 1 through 7 today. And this lesson is entitled, The General Principles of Marriage and Sexual Relationship. The General Principles of Marriage and Sexual Relations, chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. Let me read this text, and then we'll go back and make some points about it. "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me," verse 2, "it is good for..." "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority of her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner, and another in that manner. Again, that's 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 7, and I just read from the New King James translation. All right, so here Paul lays out the general principles of marriage relationships. Now notice he does say up here, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And so we must recognize that this is given in a context that he does mention. He'll mention in verse 26 and 28 that there will be trouble in the flesh if you do this. For example, let me just read this in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 26, 1 Corinthians 7, 26. Paul says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of this present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. And in this section, beginning in verse 25, he's talking about virgins, people who are unmarried. And so he says it's good to remain as they are because of this present distress that he mentions. Then down in verse 28, but even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. And so there, even though he's recommending that people stay single, he does realize that he cannot make that commandment because God allows marriage. And so he says, even if you marry, you have not sinned, but he warns them you will have trouble in the flesh. And he wants to spare them of that trouble. And remember, we do read in 1 Timothy chapter 4 that some of those doctrines of demons that Paul mentioned there, one of them has to do with forbidding to marry. And so he is not forbidding to marry, but he's just saying here in 1 Corinthians 7, it's better if they did not marry, again, because of this present distress. Now, exactly what this present distress is, it does not say. I would assume, though, it's persecution related, and, trouble in the flesh goes along with that. And so we're just thinking about those things there, all right? But trouble in the flesh. And so the present distress, so when he recommends that they remain single, going back up to verses 1 and 2, he is not making that as a law per se, but he's saying it's going to be better. Now notice also in this, he does say it's good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, All right, so a couple things right off the bat here. Well, actually, let me just mention here sexual immorality. And those who know me, when I teach on this passage here, the King James, I think, is a much better translation, fornication, because to me, sexual immorality is, going to a strip club and doing whatever you do there. But fornication is specific. In fact, fornication has to do, chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians involves bodily contact. And notice, as I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, this bodily contact does not always have to go to the point of copulation, although that for sure would be fornication. But as I give an illustration from my teenage years before I was a Christian, before I even heard about the Church of Christ, when we would have, quote, locker room talk, end quote, and a boy would be bragging about how far he got with a girl the night before, and if he said he hit a home run, we knew what that meant. If he said he got on first base, that usually meant holding hands. Well, second and third base, we don't know what that would entail. And so when it comes to fornication, we don't want to see how close we can get, but we want to stay as far away from it as we can. And so notice also, that word fornication means illicit or unlawful sexual intercourse, and that definition comes from Bauer, Art, and Gingrich. sometimes referred to as BDAG, but that was translated from German as Bauer, and I believe first in 1951 that was translated. So really what that means in today's vernacular is unlawful sexual interaction. Unlawful sexual interaction. Now again, how far that interaction goes, I'm not here to define that before it's called fornication, but we just want to stay as far away from it as we can. But notice he does use the word touch parallel with fornication or sexual immorality. Notice again in verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality. Or the old King James says, nevertheless, to avoid fornication. And so he uses touch parallel with sexual immorality or fornication. And so some touching would involve that. And again, we're not here to define exactly how far you can go before it goes from, just touching to just going over into fornication, but again, we want to stay as far away from that as we can. And so that's what Paul is saying. And so to avoid fornication, there's only one thing to do. Let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And so again, this goes back to the principles found in Genesis 2:24 and Matthew 19:5 and 6. Marriage is for the sexual relationship. That relationship is not dirty, it's not bad, it's great in the realm where God gave it, and that is in a scriptural marriage. And so that's where it needs to take place. Now, this tells us that, there's a couple reasons for people to get married. And number one reason that we find in Genesis is companionship, a helpmeet. Also, we find in Genesis 1:26 and 27, actually 26 through 28, we find there to bring forth children, to be fruitful and multiply. And then also for the sexual relationship, as we see here. Now, those are three reasons why people should marry. And, any one of those reasons, I guess any one of those reasons, except for companionship, companionship, and that's why I put it number one reasons is for companionship, because a person can marry and not be able to have the sexual relationship. Suppose somebody is paralyzed, from the neck down. Well, that person can still marry, and so the sexual relationship isn't necessary for marriage, although it is a very important part of it, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I've heard people say that they've got married and then they never, what's the word they use there? They never, set it in stone because they didn't have the sexual relationship, and so now I can divorce or remarry. Well, that's not what God has in mind with marriage, all right? But let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband, okay? And so that is the basic thing that Paul is going to talk about here. And so celibacy or being single is lawful, and indeed is preferable under these present circumstances, but it is not always expedient. And that's why we're going to have this, that's why the title of this season is The Expediencies of Marriage, a study of 1 Corinthians 7. Because 1 Corinthians 7 is not so much about who to marry as about when to marry and under what circumstances. And so just keep that in mind as we go through this. All right, now in verses 3 through 5, Paul talks about marriage and the obligations and privileges of marriage. Each marriage is, or each spouse in the marriage is obligated to give oneself to the other spouse. All right, notice again in verse 3, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the husband. And so each in the marriage has an obligation to fulfill. Now that word due, actually in the New King James, the affection due her, or in the Old King James it says due benevolence, and that is to tell us that each in the marriage owes the other, and that includes the sexual relationship. In marriage, each spouse is to give his or her body to the other spouse, and therefore all sexual rights are transferred to each other's spouses. Notice in verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now notice the first part of verse 4, Paul's contemporaries would be saying, Amen, Brother Paul, you preach it. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. But yet Paul reverses that right in the middle of that verse, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And that would be unheard of in most of that culture that Paul is writing to in the first century Greco-Roman world, especially among Paul's people, the Jews, although he's the apostle to the Gentiles. But notice, and we could use this as an argument for inspiration, there's no way in the world Paul would write the latter half of that verse based upon his culture from his own mind. But that could be a sign of, in fact, I think it could be used for at least a necessary, not sufficient of itself, at least necessary sign that the Bible is inspired of God. Nevertheless, he does say in verse 5, well, actually, before we move on to verse 5, because the other spouse owns the body, well, let me put it this way, the wife has authority over the husband's body, and the husband has authority over the wife's body. And so the sexual relationship is due benevolence. It is what is owed to one another. Now in verse 5, do not deprive one another of that relationship, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you for your lack of self-control. And so this is very important. Do not deprive one another, or the Old King James says, do not defraud one another. And that word, the Greek word behind that, means to steal, to rob, or to deny. And that same word is used back up in chapter 6 and verse 8, where he says, and here he's talking about those who take other people, members of the church, who take other members of the church to court over spiritual things. And that's the key, over spiritual things. But he says there, no, you yourselves do wrong and cheat, and you do these things to your brethren. And that word cheat right there is the same word that's translated defrauding. And I should go back up to verse 7, 1 Corinthians 6:7. Now, therefore, it is already an utter failure for you that go to law against one another. Why do you not rather accept wrong? Why do you not rather let yourselves be cheated? No, you yourselves do wrong and cheat. You do these things to your brethren. And again, the word cheat there, the word cheated, is the same word that's translated defraud over here in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5. And so it's very serious when we cheat or rob one spouse of that relationship that's due in marriage. And so notice when we go back to verse 5, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. And so here's an exception. And that's the same word except that we find in other places, like John 3, verse 5, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. And Matthew 19:9, whosoever puts away his wife, except it be for fornication. And so here, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. And so it's okay to refrain from sexual relationships as long as both spouses agree, and it's only to be for a limited time. And this, has a lot of implications, especially for preachers or really active members of the church who maybe go on mission trips, maybe do some other things. But even without the spiritual reasons, maybe someone's, parent is ill in another state, and so the spouse needs to go stay with that parent until he or she can heal or recover from surgery or get used to a new life with, maybe in a wheelchair or something like that. And so there are times in lives where husband and wives must separate for a time, and they must agree upon that they will refrain from the sexual relationship. Notice, because he goes on to say that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so temptation can really come, and temptation can be there when we are apart, when husband and wife are apart from one another. And that's one reason why a lot of professions have a very high divorce rate. I'm thinking perhaps military would be one of those high instances, because when one spouse is deployed, especially if it's overseas or somewhere where the wife cannot come, when a spouse is deployed, then there's a lot of temptation left because that relationship is gone. And I know when in my life, when my wife passed away in 2010, and of course, once I got over the grieving process, there's some temptation there, because when a person is used to having that relationship for many years and then all of a sudden it's gone, there is a temptation that can be there for that. And so, once I knew it was time for me to move on, I did start to look for a spouse, and I'll have more to say about that throughout this study as well, what to look for in a spouse and things like that. And the Lord blessed me, but that's another lesson in and of itself. All right, but this temptation, do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, in the Old King James translation, they use the word incontinency, which I never knew what that meant, incontinency, until I was on vacation one time with my wife, celebrating a honeymoon, and I saw a store, a medical supply store, that said incontinency supplies. And, of course, they had some things like diapers and things like that there. And so then it kind of dawned on me, that's what that word means. Of course, I did do a study on it, and I did come to realize that it means a lack of self-control, a lack of self-control. And so Satan will tempt us when we are separated from our spouse. He will tempt us, and we may fall into that temptation with a lack of self-control. But he goes on to say in verses 6 and 7, all are not gifted with the necessary level of self-control as Paul was to remain single or to remain celibate. Now notice in verse 6 he says, this I say as a concession, not as a commandment. This I say as a concession, not as a commandment. And that goes better with what he says in verse 7, for I wish that all men were even as I myself. Now notice, I wish. In other words, he's not commanding everyone to be as Paul. Now when he says as I myself, he's talking about single without a wife. And so again, this is a concession. He's saying this as a, it's good to think about this. It's good. I'm advising this. And again, this is based upon that trouble in the flesh that he's talking about. Again, this whole chapter where Paul is saying it's better to be single, it's better to not be married, is because of that present distress. Now, he's going to say at least 2 times, in fact 3 times at least, that you have not sinned if you marry, even under this situation. Because again, marriage is honorable. It's a God-given privilege, a God-given, authorized institution for all people and even Christians to be involved in. And so he's not saying don't ever get married, but he's saying under these circumstances, it's best to remain single. And again, he says this by concession. This is not a commandment. But notice at the latter part of verse 7, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another after that manner. Now notice, again, Paul wants all to be single, but he recognizes that all are not able. And notice, even as I myself, Paul was not married when this was written, even though he had the right to. Remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, when Paul is talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols in chapters 8, 9, and 10, which, by the way, that section also has that now concerning the things that you wrote unto me. And so they asked him a question about that. But in 1 Corinthians 8, he says, there's no such thing as an idol. But then in chapter 9, he basically saying just because we have a right to do something doesn't mean we have to do it. And he's again illustrating the point about eating meat sacrificed to idol. There's no problem with God if we eat that meat, but just because we have a right to eat it doesn't mean we have to. And so he gives the illustration, do not I have a right to be married? And of course, Paul did have a right. In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, he did have a right to marry, but he did not exercise that right. And as far as we know, he stayed single his whole life until he died shortly after writing 2 Timothy chapter 4. And so, but notice also Paul attributes his self-control as a gift of God. Notice each one has his own gift from God, one after this manner and another after that manner. And so Paul considers himself gifted to be able to remain single and without a wife, which of course is the definition of single. Now in Matthew 19, we looked at this last episode, Matthew 19, verses 11 through 12. There Jesus mentioned some are eunuchs from their mother's womb, some are made eunuchs of men, but others make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. And so sometimes an option, of course, in Matthew 19 context, the option is, if you're divorced for unscriptural reasons, you can still serve God. We'll get to that in 1 Corinthians 7, but you cannot violate God's law on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But you can still, as a divorcee, you can still serve God and be faithful to Him as any other Christian can with certain limitations. But notice here, to remain single, he says, is a gift from God. But in Matthew 19, remember those eunuchs, and so that one who's made a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake, he is one who is intentionally refraining from that sexual relationship for the kingdom of heaven's sake, for spiritual reasons, so he can be more effective, perhaps, or just to serve God in that way. So Paul was gifted to remain single. But not everybody has that gift, as he says. In fact, I've known people who've lost their spouses very early in life, and they live the next 50 years or so single, never desiring to remarry. However, there are some people that lose their wife, and they marry kind of quickly after that. And, of course, the grieving process is all different for everybody, and there are other factors involved. But, some people can stay single longer. Some people choose to stay single longer. Some people marry sooner. But when we think about marriage, and I want to mention this, I probably should have mentioned it back up in verse 2, where it says, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. That if a marriage is only for the sexual relationship, so I can have, quote, legal sex, unquote, then that marriage is probably not going to last very long. Because, if that's the only reason, and bodies change, desires change, things change over time, and if we're not committed to that person, as per Genesis 2:24, repeated again in Matthew 19, 5 and 6, and by the way, repeated again in Ephesians 5, 31 through 33, if we're not committed to that spouse as a person because we love God and love that spouse, if we're not committed to that person because of that, then our desire for the sexual relationship is not a good, solid foundation upon which to marry. Now, it's part of the marriage, a very important part of the marriage, I might add, as per 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. But if that's the only reason why we want to marry somebody, then that's not going to last long. And so we will get into more things following in the next episode. But for now, just remember that marriage is very important. And that as Paul begins this chapter on the expediencies of marriage, he is going back to what the foundation God has already laid from Genesis, and again repeated in the New Testament, that for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Genesis 2:24. That is the basis of marriage, upon which Paul establishes very early in this chapter, so that he can continue on with the expediencies of marriage. Well, we appreciate you joining us for this episode, and we'd invite you for the next episode as we continue our discussion on 1 Corinthians chapter 7.
Blessed glory land, I have trusted in his love, and now I am heaven bound. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory. Praise the Lord. Blessed Lord, salvation has been brought down from heaven. Go and shout and shout and shout and tell it the world around. Go preach it and tell it today to people in sorrow. Tell it today and tell it tomorrow. Preach the word of God that we might win a shining crown. Heaven, tell the lost, all lost. Salvation is full and free to sinners. Spread the blessed news all over the land and sea. Go teach it and tell it.